So we're back in models.go in the data folder inside the logger service, and let's write a few more database methods. So after this one, I'll add one to get a log entry by ID. So func with the receiver L pointer to log entry, and I'll call this get1, and it'll just take one parameter ID of type string, and it will return a pointer to a log entry and potentially an error. So we're going to have our context logic, so I'll copy all these lines right here, okay, from the previous function. And that sets up our context and gets our collection. And the next thing I need to do is to convert the ID I'm getting as a parameter in a call to this function to the correct format so I can actually look something up in Mongo. And we do that by declaring a new variable. Doc_id is a good one. And we'll check for an error when we call primitive, which is part of the driver package for Mongo, .object ID from hex, right there. And we just give that ID, which we got as a call to this function. And if we have an error, then we'll return nil and the error. Okay? And of course, this should be an assignment operator. That's better. So at this point, we have the correct ID in the correct format, and we can try the lookup. So we need somewhere to store the result. So we'll declare a variable var entry of type log entry. And we'll check for an error when we call collection.find1. And that requires the context, which we declared right up there on line 87. And it requires the doc ID, but we need to put it in bson.m format. And then in curly brackets, we're going to look for _ID, and we're going to match doc_id. Okay? And then we decode that into our variable. Decode into a reference to entry. And of course, we check for an error, so I'll copy and paste this. And if we get past that, then we just return a reference to entry. So we'll return a reference to entry because we want a pointer, and nil for the error. Okay? So that allows us to find something by its ID in Mongo. And we may as well put one in here to drop the entire collection. In other words, you're getting rid of all the log entries. And the next time somebody tries to insert something into that collection, it will be created if it doesn't exist. So func L pointer to log entry. And I'll just call this drop collection. And in our case, I'm not going to take any parameters since we only have one collection. But you could also pass the name of the collection if necessary, and the name of the database for that matter. So we need the context again and the collection. So let's copy this stuff and paste it here. Now I have my context, I have my collection. So we'll just say if error equals, or is assigned the value of, collection.drop, and we're going to drop using the context, which is why we have it. Then a semicolon. If the error is not equal to nil, then we'll simply return the error. Otherwise, we return nil. So that's pretty straightforward. And we might also want a means to update an entry in the database. So func L pointer to log entry, and we'll just call this update. We don't need to take any parameters because we can get it right off the receiver. And it will return a pointer to Mongo update result. Better spell Mongo right though. Mongo.update result. What happened when we tried to update this? And potentially an error. And we're going to need our context, so let's get that. And paste it in here. We're also going to need our collection. I should have copied that too. Copy. Paste. And we'll have to get our doc_id in the right format, so I can copy this and just change it as necessary. So there's our doc_id. And we'll paste that, and we're not changing ID. we're changing L.id, okay? Because we get that from the receiver. So we have our context, we have our collection, we have our doc ID. So now we'll get a result and potentially an error when we call collection.update1, right there. And that requires, and I'll put these on separate lines so they're easier to read. It requires our context. It requires the doc ID, again in bson.m format, looking for ID, lowercase, and matching that with doc ID. And then what do we want to update it to? And in this case, we can just say bson.d, which is the format it has to be in, and then use curly brackets. And then inside of that, have another set of curly brackets, starting with $set, which is a Mongo command. And then we have to give it its parameter, its second parameter, in bson.d format. And on the next line, in curly brackets, name is now set to whatever L.name is from the receiver. Data, which has to be in quotes, data is now set to L.data. And then a comma. And the only other thing to change is updated at is now set to time.now, because we're updating it right now. And then a comma. And then a comma here, and a comma here. And we'll check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, then return nil and the error. Otherwise, return the update result from Mongo, which is result, and no error. Okay, in theory, this should be all of the methods we're going to need for this course. And they're very straightforward, and some of them we might not even use. But in any case, it's convenient to have them. So in the next lecture, we'll finish up our connection to the Mongo database and try it out and see if we can actually connect. Now, it does say I have an error here somewhere. Right here. These should be commas, not colons. That was sloppy. Okay, and we do have a warning from this, but it's pretty straightforward. Uses unkeyed fields. I don't have a problem with that. You can put the keys in if you want to. Just go look at that particular type. But most people tend to write them this way, myself included. Okay? So let's move on and try connecting to Mongo and making sure we can actually reach the database.